Welcome back, everyone. I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and if you've been following this playlist, you have officially made it to my favorite video in the series. And that's because we're going to write some really cool code here. In the last couple of videos, we connected our app to CloudKit, we got the current user's information, we uploaded some data, we uploaded images, we added push notifications, and all of that code is working. It's great. But the way we wrote that code is not scalable. We can't reuse that code in other applications because it's tied directly into the view models that we made in those videos. So in this video, we're gonna take all of that code, extract it into its own utility class so that the code in this utility class we could then just reuse in other projects, in other files, in other view models, and we don't have to go in and try to rewrite our CloudKit code every single project. And possibly my favorite part of this is that we're going to use so much of the other stuff that we've covered previously in this series. So if you've been following along, you're going to get a lot out of this because we're going to incorporate generics and protocols and even future publishers to create this utility class. All right, we are back in Xcode for, I think, my favorite video in this series, honestly. In the last, I think, 3 or 4 videos, we wrote a lot of CloudKit code. In the first video, we added some code for getting the user's cloud status and requesting their permission for iCloud. In the second video, we did a bunch of CRUD functions for creating, updating, deleting iCloud records. And in the last video, we even subscribed to actually send push notifications through subscriptions in CloudKit. And we've written a lot of really good code so far. However, the code we've written, although it works and you could easily put this directly into your app, it's not very scalable. It's not very efficient because a lot of this code that we are writing so far is tied directly into our record types. And maybe this title is specifically for these fruits, and the code is not very reusable. So although this code works, and it gets us to where we want to be in our app, it's not very practical for a larger, bigger scale application. So what we're going to do in this video is basically take all of the code that we have and kind of rewrite it into what we're going to call a CloudKit utility class. It's going to be a utility class that basically will handle all of our CloudKit functions, but it won't have anything specifically related to fruits or a specific record type. So this way the functions are a little more generic. We can reuse them in this project, in another project, and it will just be a lot more scalable in the end. This will be much more aligned with how it would or should be done in larger production apps. So I think this will be a really great learning opportunity for those of you who are just following these courses through, because as we write this, we're going to actually use a lot of the other things that we've already covered in this series. So earlier in this series, I covered how to use protocols, how to use generics, and even how to use futures. And in this video, we're going to actually use all of these to make this awesome utility class. And that's kind of, again, why I do all of these playlists in order, because we are building on our skills. And this is going to be a real-life, real-world example on when we can and should be using all of these to write some really good, efficient, scalable code. So if you don't know what any of these are, I highly recommend going back and watching those videos first. You can see them over here. I have the Futures Bootcamp, we did a Protocols Bootcamp, we did a Generics Bootcamp. Those are all in this playlist in earlier videos. And now that we are experts and we know all that, we can write some awesome code. So with that said, I'm going to actually X out of the simulator because we're not going to need that for the rest of this video. Let's go full screen here and let's get coding. All right, guys, let's get rocking and rolling and writing some code here. So let's start by, I'm going to go to our CloudKit Bootcamp folder. I'm going to right click it and create a new file. And this is just going to be a Swift file because I don't need a Swift UI view. We're not going to use any view in this video. We're just going to create some Swift code. So Swift file, and let's call this CloudKit utility. Click create, and when we are inside of this file, it's just a plain file. The first thing let's do is import CloudKit, of course, and let's create a class, and let's call it the name of our file. So CloudKit utility, and we'll open the brackets. And for those of you following along, I just want to point out really quickly that we're not going to conform to observable object here because this is not a class that's being observed from the view. So we don't need to conform to observable object here. This is just a class called CloudKit utility. So what we're going to do for this video is actually open up two screens side by side. So I'm going to click this little plus icon in the top right corner here, not the library, but like this one here, add editor on the right. And it will pop up a second editor on my screen. So while I'm clicked on the left side here, I'm going to jump into the CloudKit user bootcamp. And then I'm going to close the navigator because we're not going to use it for a minute. So I have my CloudKit user bootcamp that we did 2 or 3 videos ago on the left side, and I have our new CloudKit utility on the right side. And what we're going to basically do is take all of these CloudKit functions, anything that's referencing the CK anything basically, and move those into our CloudKit utility class. So anything that's interacting directly with CloudKit is going to go in our utility. This way our view model doesn't have to worry about CloudKit. The utility will do all the work for CloudKit. So the first function, of course, is going to be get iCloud status. So inside this CloudKit utility, I'm going to create a static func, and I'm going to call it get iCloud status, open close parentheses, open brackets. Now I want to point out I'm making this a static func. So normally when we create classes, we create instances of the class. So for example, this view model, we have an instance of it, which we created right here. A lot of times we'll create singletons for classes, so you might do static let instance equals something. But in this case, this get iCloud status function that we're going to do is just going to call this function, and it's going to return some data. There's nothing that's going to be set inside this class, like any kind of variables or constants that we need reference to. So because of that, we don't really need an instance of this class. So what I'm making is a static function, which is just at the class level. So to call this static function, we just call CloudKit utility dot get iCloud status. We don't actually have to enter into any kind of instance of CloudKit utility ever. I don't know if you guys already knew that or that was overkill or what, but I just wanted to throw that out there because I'm going to make all of the functions in this class static. This way we never have to deal with any instances of our utility. We can just always access these functions from whenever and wherever in our code. All right, so in this function, we basically want to do everything that we're doing in this function. So I'm going to copy this code, paste it into here. Let's look at it really quickly. So we have ckcontainer.default, count status. So in our code right now, we have that reference to weak self. And self, when we called it in our view model here, is referencing that class, that instance of that class. But here we don't have an instance, so we don't actually even need this weak self here. Instead, the weak self is still going to be called inside our view model, which you'll see in a second. So we don't need the weak self, and then because we are not actually updating the UI here, we can stay on the background thread. We don't need to go back onto a main thread. So I'm going to cut this switch statement and get rid of our dispatch queue and just put in our switch statement here. And now, of course, this is signed into iCloud, this error. These are all references that are inside the instance of our view model that we were referring to. But we don't have any of these references inside this function. Instead, we just want to return this from the function. And again, we can't just return out of this function because this in here is actually asynchronous code. When we call account status, it might take a second or two to actually get the data and return. So we can't immediately return something from this function. Instead, we have to use that escape enclosure. And I've covered these escape enclosures now a bunch of times in this playlist as well as the last one, so I'm assuming you guys are getting more comfortable. But let's call this completion, and let's make it at escaping. And what are we going to return here? So we want to return a value if they are signed in or signed out. That's probably going to be true or false. But if there's an error, we want to send out that error. So the most efficient way to handle this is actually using something called a result. And we use results a lot in Combine. If we're using publishers and subscribers, those are giving us results. Every time we switch on those completions where it has like finished or failure, that's switching on a result. So in here, I'm going to get rid of the underscore and just return a result. And a result needs to have
If it's successful, we're going to return a Boolean, and if not, we're going to return an error. And then this escape enclosure will return nothing. It will just be a void function, so I'll use the arrow and then the open close parentheses. So we call get iCloud status with our escape enclosure, which should return a result. So now when we handle these, all we need to do is return those results. So here we're going to call the completion handler, open the parentheses, and then we need to pass a result inside. So I'll press the period, and we have either success or failure. And of course, if it's available, this is success. So then we need to pass in a Boolean, and I'll pass in true. Delete this line of code. And now for the no account, we are going to call our CloudKit error, which we can't find CloudKit error in scope because that's in our view model. So I'm going to come back to our view model quickly. Let's just copy this CloudKit error. Let's paste it into our CloudKit utility. So now our CloudKit utility will have the only reference to the CloudKit error. We're going to delete the view model stuff in a second. For no account, we'll call completion failure. And the error is going to be the CloudKit error dot iCloud not found. Here we're going to call completion failure, and it will be CloudKit error iCloud not determined. Here we'll call completion, let's do dot failure, and we're going to do iCloud restricted, and then finally completion failure iCloud unknown. And I'll delete this code here. All right, so all of our errors should go away now. And now that we have this function set up, I want you guys to notice that there's nothing in this class right here that is related to our current app. There's nothing about fruits. There's nothing about this app. This is pretty much generic code. So I can literally just copy this as it is and paste this file into any project I'm ever working on. And all I need to do is call get iCloud status, and I never have to worry about rewriting this code. That's why we're making this utility class, because once we get these utility classes in place, it's much more scalable, much more reusable. So now back in my view model, I'm going to instead call the CloudKit utility dot get iCloud status. And then the completion I'll press enter on, and this will call completion. And then we can switch on the completion. And we'll have our cases. Case success, we'll say let bool. And for right now, we'll just break. And then we have case.failure, and we'll say let error. And we don't have a default case, so we can get rid of that. We can break here as well. So if it's successful, that means it was the available. We want to set self.sign into iCloud equal to true. So I'll do here, I will copy this and paste it here. So now is when we actually need to add in back in that weak self. So that's going to be on this closure, and we'll have self.isSigned into iCloud. And we're going to set that equal to the bool. So this should actually be success, and we'll set it equal to the success, which we know will be true. And then down here, we'll set self.error equal to the error that we got back from our failure dot localized description. And these are updating our UI, so we should actually go back to the main thread in here. So we'll call dispatch queue.main.async and paste our code in there. So now we don't need this whole block of code, and we don't need our CloudKit error. So our view model for getting the iCloud status is getting a little shorter, and we don't have to worry about our CloudKit code as much. And let's just check that this is working before we move forward. So I'm going to make this CloudKit user bootcamp the first file in my app. Let's make this the first file. Let's run it to the simulator. We got a lot of code going on here, guys. All right, so when the simulator pops up here, if the is signed into iCloud turns to true, from right here, we know this is still working. So my simulator pops up and is signed in is clearly true, so we know this code is working. We're going to take this one step even further, because we are expert developers at this point. So right now we're using, again, this escaping closure, and we know how to do it. It works, but we can improve on it, and we love to use Combine, right? So what we're going to do is actually import Combine to our CloudKit utility. And then we're going to create another static func and call it get iCloud status. Same exact thing. Open close parentheses, open brackets, except this one is going to return a future. And a future needs basically a result as well. So we'll give it a bool and an error, just like we have in our result up here. And if you don't know what a future is, I covered it maybe 5 videos back in this series, and it's why I did it before this video, of course. So in this function, let's return our future. And we'll open the parentheses, and we'll attempt to fulfill a promise. And in here, we're going to call the CloudKit utility .get iCloud status. We're going to call the one with our completion handler. And then we'll press enter on it, and this will be our result here. And then in here, we could switch on the result, right? So we could do basically the same thing we just did. We could do a switch on the result, sort of just like this, and then call our promise. However, we know that this result is of type bool and error. And we know that the promise that we want is actually bool and error. So we can actually get rid of this code completely and just call our promise directly and pass in the result. So whether or not this result is successful or a failure, that's exactly what we're going to promise in our function here. So now that we're going to use this function, I'm going to make this function private because I'm not going to use this in my app anymore. So I can only access this one outside of this class. So I'm going to come back into our view model now, and I will leave this code here for you guys if you want to use it. But what we're going to actually call is CloudKit utility.get iCloud status, and this one now is returning a future with a bool and an error. And this is a future publisher that we went over a couple videos back. And so in my view model, let's import Combine. Let's create our var cancelables, which will be a set of any cancelable. And then when we get this publisher, let's just sync it. And here we have our completion. So we can switch on the completion. We have case.finished, in which case we'll just break, and case.failure, let error. And we don't have a default here. And let's just take this code from our other error, paste it in here. So this again needs to be a weak reference, weak self, and this received value will be our success. So we'll call this success, and we're going to make this a weak self, and then we're going to call the same thing that we called here, right in here. And lastly, we want to store this in our cancelables. So I'm going to build this to the simulator one more time, and if it loads correctly, it should still say signed in as true. Awesome. And we got that one error here that we can't publish from the background thread. So when we did this iCloud stuff, it went to the background thread. So we want to receive on the dispatch queue.main, and we don't need any options. Let's run it one more time just to make sure this error goes away, because now we are receiving on the main thread. And true, no error. And just like that, we've made this super handy iCloud status function, and then we converted it even further into a future publisher so that we can actually use CloudKit with Combine now, which is awesome. All right, so that's basically what we're going to do for the rest of these functions. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker now because there's a lot of functions that we want to get through. One thing I'm going to do is, now that my code is going to actually use the future version of this get iCloud status, I'm going to make this function private. This way, nowhere else in my code can ever access this function. Instead, we can only access this one, so we know everyone's using the Combine method. Because of that, we can just delete this code just to clean up our code a little bit in the view model. Our next one is request permission. So I'm going to come down here. Let's do it down below this error. I'm going to create a static func. Let's call it request. Let's call it request application permission. Open close parentheses, open brackets. And in here, I'm going to literally copy the code again, paste it in here. Let's check it out quickly. We don't need a reference to weak self. This user discoverability is fine. We don't need to go back to the main thread, so we can delete that bit of code. And then, so if the return status is granted, we return true. So in this function, we are converting the return status to something that is actually usable in our app. So we could return the return status back out to the rest of our app. If we want the rest of our app to be able to access this return status and get the exact permission status, we can do that and put that into our completion handler here. But for our purposes right now, all we care about is when they request the application permission, is it successful, is it true, or is it false? That's all I care about. I don't really care exactly what the return status is. So we're going to convert it to a Boolean. So just like this completion handler, we're going to use the same one here. It's going to be completion with a result with a bool or an error. And in here, we're going to say if return status is granted, we will call completion. And we'll do .success true. And I'll say else. So if it's not granted, if it's anything else, we'll call completion.failure. And we need to pass in an error. Let's create another CloudKit error. We'll do case. Let's do iCloud application permission not granted. Not granted. I think that works. And here, this will be a CloudKit error dot not granted. Just like that. And we're going to make another future. So I'll copy this, paste it here. And you guys don't have to create the futures if you want to stick with those escaping closures, but I think this is good practice for now. So I'm going to call this get application permission again. And this time, let's call the get application permission, which also gives us a result of bool and error, so we can keep this code as well. I'm going to make this one private and this one public. So in our code here, we can then call CloudKit utility dot request application permission. We can receive on the main thread. We can do all this completion stuff again, but I don't really care about it because I just want to move quickly here. So let's just call .sync, and I'm just going to press enter and not actually fill in the completion. You guys know how to do that because we just did it here. This will be a weak self with the success in, and here we're going to set self.permission status equal to success. Finally, we want to store this in our cancelables as well. And just to point out here, we're storing these in our cancelables. We could make these individual any cancelables and not part of the set so that we can cancel them as soon as we finish. I've covered all that in previous videos, so I'm not going to go over that again. But request permission should be working. So let's run that on the simulator quickly. And the permission should be the third text on my screen. All right, permission is still true. Let's keep going here. And let's look at the next function here. So we have this fetch iCloud user record ID. Let's see, this is returning the current user's record ID. And then we're using that to call discover iCloud user. So really from our iCloud utility, we only really need to call discover iCloud user, and we need that function to actually get the user ID and then discover the user. So let's start migrating these to our utility class here. So I'm going to copy this code here. Let's create a static func. Let's call it fetch user record ID. Paste in that code here. And then let's take our discover iCloud user. Let's also copy this function. So here let's do a static func, and let's call it something for a second. And I'm going to call it discover user identity. So I'm just trying to use the same words that the actual CloudKit containers, that the actual CloudKit framework uses. This way it will just be a little easier to understand. When we call this, we need to pass in an ID, which is of type CKRecordID. So I'll paste that into the parameter. Let's make this full screen so we can see it a little easier here. And we can see that both of these are returning possible errors. This is returning an identity, this one's returning an ID. But because there is a possible success as well as an error, we're just going to roll with what we've been doing with these results. So let's copy this completion handler here and paste it down here. So we have our completion. This one is going to a result of, and we're going to use a CKRecordID here and an error. So if we get the ID, we want to call the completion success with that ID. And then we'll do else. And then of course we want to call the completion dot failure, and we want to pass in an error. So we don't have an error here, so let's create another CloudKit error. We'll create a case iCloud could not, and then let's do fetch user record ID. Let's just call it that for now. We'll put in our CloudKit error dot could not fetch user record ID. We don't need a reference to weak self in here. And I do want to point out here really quick that we are getting these returned errors here. So instead of using these, we could just do like a else if let error equals returned error. And then we can call our completion and we can pass in our error. So we don't actually need to use our custom error, although I find these custom errors a little bit easier to follow because I know exactly where they're coming from in my code. Because I don't know exactly what all of the returned errors are. I just want to point out that depending on how you want to set this up and the rest of your code, you might want to use the returned errors from CloudKit because sometimes they're more descriptive. But personally, for some of my utilities, from some of my utility classes, I like to make my own errors so I can get a little more descriptive. And we can give our own errors custom language as well, but we're not going to get into that in this video. I just want to let you guys know that you can do that, although we're not going to. So I'll leave that one there for now. And then we have our discover user identity. We don't need our weak self. Returned identity, returned error. We don't need to go on the main thread, so let's get rid of that. And let's see, we want to return the user name from this. So another completion handler we're going to call here. Let's call our completion handler with not a CK record, but we're going to return a string. So in here, if we can get this name, let's call completion, and we'll call .success, and we'll pass in the name. We'll say else. So again, if there was an error, we could pass in the error, but I'm going to create a custom error. So let's do up here, case iCloud could not discover user. And let's paste that here, completion dot failure, CloudKit error, could not discover user. So we have this function working and we have this function working. And when we looked in our view model here, we noticed that when we called fetch iCloud user record ID, it called this fetch user record and then immediately called our discover user, which called this and then got our username. So all we really want to do from our view model is call a function and then get that user's name back. We don't care about all this stuff in the middle. We don't care about this function. We don't care about this function. We just want to call a function from our view and then get the name back. So what I'm going to do is in our utility class here, discover user identity, I'm going to create another static func called discover user identity, open close parentheses and open the brackets. So inside this function, we're going to first call fetch user record ID. So we'll call fetch user record ID, which will give us back that completion. So we're going to have two completions here. Let's be specific. So let's call this fetch completion. And we can switch on the fetch completion. So case dot, let's do success, let record ID. Let's break for a second. Case.failure, let error. All right. Let's break here as well. So when we call discover user identity, the only thing we want to get back is a possible string or an error. So this is the completion basically that we want to pass there. I'm just going to paste it here. And now if we get an error just from fetching the user record ID, let's call the completion and get out of this code. We don't need to do anything else. We already got an error. So we'll call completion, failure, and we'll pass in our error here. On the contrary, if we do get that record ID, we immediately then want to call the discover user identity function here. So inside this success, let's call CloudKit utility dot discover user identity. And we're going to pass in the one with the ID here. So we'll pass in the record ID. And then here we're going to get a completion back. So just to walk you guys through this quickly, if I press enter, this will be the, let's call this discover completion. And we can again switch on the discover completion. Case success, let, this will be name, the user name that comes back, and we can break for a second. Case.failure, let error. Let's get rid of this default code here. So again, if we get an error, we want to call our completion with the error. But if we get a success, we want to call our completion dot success, and we want to pass in our name. Now I want to point out here that the completion we're getting back from discover user identity, that's a result with a string and an error. This is the exact same as the completion in this function, right? Result with a string and an error. So we could switch on it like beginner developers would do right here, but it's the same completion. So writing all of this code is really not doing anything different than just returning the completion as is. So what we're going to do instead is call discover user identity. We'll pass in our record ID, and then here we're just going to call completion. So here we're just going to call the completion on whatever is inside that completion. I know it's almost like Inception, but it is awesome. And because we're only calling this from our code, we can make this one private, we can make this one private. So we never access these directly from our view model, we only access this one. Awesome. And then if that wasn't enough, so we could just use this function into our code, everything would be fine. But of course, we like Combine, we like futures. So I'm going to take our future from up here, and let's just paste in another future. I'm going to call it discover user identity again. And then this one will be a future that returns a string and an error. We're going to promise to call discover user identity. It's going to give us another result with a string and an error, and we'll just pass that into our future here. And we're only going to call this from our code, so we'll make this one private. Awesome. And as I said, we could have just used this escape enclosure. This would work perfectly fine. I'm just trying to get some practice in using these futures because I think they're awesome. Let's go back to our code and let's just create another func here called get current user name. And we'll call CloudKit utility dot discover user identity. And just like we do up here, I'm just going to copy this, paste it here. This will be, the received value is going to be returned name, the return user's name, and we'll set self.username equal to the returned name. And now I'm going to I can delete both of these functions. And we just need to then call our new function here called get current user name. I'm going to run the app one more time, and if the current username is pulling through, we know we wrote all of our code correctly. So let's see, it should say Nick. Awesome, there it is, just like that. So I just want to point out again here, now our view model, the view model that we have here is doing all the same stuff, except we don't have any reference to CloudKit in here. So we have our CloudKit utility, but there's no functions in here that are actually calling CK anything. So we can even delete CloudKit. We don't even need to import CloudKit to our view model anymore. I can build the app and it's going to run perfectly. So our CloudKit functions are decoupled from the rest of our app. I think this is awesome because this is so much easier to read than all of that other stuff. And this is reusable because now I can just call this in any code from any view model, from any project, and it'll work out perfectly. Believe it or not, though, we have some more code to do, and it's going to get a little bit harder because we have not used generics yet, which I'm going to show you, and I'm pretty excited to go over with you guys. So that's it for this file. That was the first video we did in this CloudKit section, and now we're going to jump into the second video. So let's open up our CloudKit CRUD bootcamp, and let's get cracking in here. Let's keep it moving, guys. We are here in our CloudKit CRUD bootcamp view model, and let's see, where do we want to start in this one? Let's start, what was the first thing that we did? I guess the first thing we did was add button pressed, and then we called add item, and then we created a CK or record, and which possibly had an image. We wrote that image, and then we saved it, and so we have our save function. So the first thing we should do is probably our save function. So I want to keep my utility class nice and organized. So right now we have our main CloudKit utility, and then we have all of our functions that we just wrote for the current user. So I'm going to actually cut all of those functions. Let's create an extension for CloudKit utility. And I'm just going to create a mark, and this will be user functions. And I will paste in all of those functions. And I'm just going to take out the error because we can use the error and reuse that. So I will paste the error in our default class up here. And then we have all of our CloudKit user functions inside this extension. So I'm going to click right here and Command Option left arrow, just fold up all of our CloudKit user functions. Let's stay organized. And next, let's do a mark, and let's call it CRUD functions. And let's create another extension for CloudKit utility, and we'll get going here. All right, so let's start with the hardest function that we have to write here, and I think that's actually going to be our fetch items. So I'm going to go to our fetch items here. We got a lot of stuff to do in this fetch items. It's going to get crazy. I hope you guys are ready. Go grab a coffee if you're not, because it's about to get real. The last thing we do in this fetch item is call this add operation, and we add it to our database. So let's just actually copy this over to our CloudKit utility. So I'm going to come over here, paste it in. Let's make it a static func, and let's make it private. So we only access this from our utility class. And let's just call it add, and we'll add operation, pass in our operation. So we need our static func, and we're going to call this fetch, open close parentheses, open the brackets. So this is what we're going to call from our view model to actually fetch all of our records. So at the end of fetch, we need to call add operation. So down here we'll call add, and then we'll pass in an operation, and this will be to execute the operation. That's what happens when we add it, it executes it. So we need to pass in an operation to this. So of course, coming back up in our view model code here, we need to create this query operation. So I'm going to, let's check this out quickly. So I'm going to copy all of this code here. Let's come back into here. And let's make a separate function for that. Static private func. Let's call it create operation. And this will return a CK query operation. All right, so let's paste the code in here. And let's see what we need to do to this function. All right, so we get our query operation. Obviously, we want to return the query operation. So the first thing we have is a predicate, and that predicate might change depending on what we want to do in our code. If we want to, use a predicate, or we want this basic predicate. So we should make that a parameter. So we'll say predicate of type NS predicate, and we will then pass our predicate into our query, into the query here. So we don't need this one. We don't need this line either. Next, we need a record type, which right now we just have fruits, but let's pass it in so we can change that if we have more records in our app. So we'll say record type of type. And if I right click and jump to the definition of CK query, we can see that the record type is of type ckrecord.record type. So that's what I will pass in here. And let's make this the record type. We have sort descriptors. So if we do query.sort descriptors, it is an optional array of NS sort descriptor here. So let's pass that as a parameter as well. I'm going to make these multiple lines just so it's easier to read. Let's do sort descriptors, type array of NS sort descriptor, and we'll make it optional in case we don't have any, and we'll give it a default value of nil, just in case, so we don't have to write nil every time. So the sort descriptors, set this equal to sort descriptors. We don't need this. Then we have our query, and then we can have a possible results limit, which is just an integer. So we'll pass in one more parameter of results limit of type integer. We'll make it optional, give it a nil value by default. And then we'll just say if let limit equals results limit. So only if we have a limit will we add one, and we'll just set this equal to the limit. All right, I'm going to put this on this line here. I'm going to highlight it, Control I to fix the spacing. So we have a create operation. It looks a little funky because I made it on multiple lines, but we pass in a predicate, we pass in a record type, pass in possible sort descriptions and a limit, and then it returns us a query operation. So now in our fetch, the first thing we can do is say let operation equals create operation. And this fetch function then needs the predicate, the record type, the sort description, the results limit, because we want to be able to use this for all of the fetches in our app, not just a specific one. So we want to be able to pass in and change all of these parameters. So what I'm going to do is copy all of these parameters from our create operation function and also add them to our fetch function. Let's pass in our predicate, let's pass in our record type, let's pass in our sort descriptors and our result limit. Let's make a little comment here, create operation. We can pass our operation into our add operation. All right, and in between here, there's a lot of other stuff that we did in our view model here. So we had this returned items, this array of fruit model that we created. So I'm going to copy that and move that into here. So we'll say this will be get items in the query. Let's start with our returned items. Right now, let's just keep it as fruit models in our code because it'll be easier to create this function dealing specifically with fruit models at first. So after we create our fruit models, the next thing we want to do is this get record matched block function. So I'm going to copy all of this code here, this matched block. Let's go back to our CloudKit utility. Create operation, I'm going to put it in the same order that it's in this function. So between create operation and add operation, let's add a static private func here. And we'll call this add record matched block. Open close parentheses, open brackets, and I'll paste in all of that code that we had. All right, so from this function, firstly, we need a reference to the operation. So we'll pass in the operation of type CK query operation. So these will call on the operation. And remember, this is for iOS 15. This is for below iOS 15. And then we get this record here, and we try to convert it. We don't need this print statement. And we try to convert it to a fruit model, and then we append it to our items array. Now, we don't have this items array inside this function here in this record match block. We have it back in our returned items. So really what we want to do is return this fruit model that we're creating from this function. So here we want to actually create a completion, which will also be at escaping. And this will be a fruit of type fruit model. And this function will return void. So down here, we will get our fruit. Let's say let fruit equals that. And then we can call completion, and we'll pass in our fruit. For this function specifically, I don't really care if there's an error, because if there's an error, we're just not going to send another fruit back. And our final array is just going to be an empty array in that case. So I don't really care about this error. So I'm just going to break. We could return a result here and deal with all that, but this video is going to be super long, so we don't need to deal with that. Down here, same thing. Let's create a fruit. We'll say let fruit equals this fruit model, and then we'll call our completion, pass in our fruit. So now that we have this function working and we don't need this error here, let's go back up to our code and let's call add record record matched block. We're going to add it to our operation, and then we have our completion, which I'll press enter on. This will be our returned fruit, and that fruit we're just going to add to our returned items. So I actually don't want this to be fruit. Let's come down and make this item, and let's make this item an item as well, and we'll make this item an item. We're going to get rid of this fruit model in a second, so that's why I'm just calling it item. So this should be an item, and we'll call here returned items dot append, and we'll just add back, and we'll add that new item. So same thing we were doing before, except the code's a little more modular, and this is easier to read, but obviously probably a little harder to write if you've never written code like this before. We have one more little section we got to do here. So after this, we have the results completion here. So I'm going to copy this. Let's go back into our code here, and let's create a static private func add. Let's call it query result block. Paste in that code here. Just like above, we need a reference to the operation, right? So we passed in our CK operation. Let's do it again here. This will be our operation. This will be our operation. We don't need these print statements anymore. We don't need our dispatch queue anymore because we're not going on to the UI right now. And we don't even have access to this returned items in this function. So we don't really need to send these returned items directly from this function, but really what we want is just execute something when these query results come back. So I'm just going to create another completion here. We'll be at escaping, and this will just be finished of type bool. And we'll make it a void function as well. So we don't need a reference to weak self in either of these places. And here we're just going to very simply call completion true. And here as well, completion true. So we're not doing any logic in this completion block really, other than when we get the completion block, we're going to call that completion handler. So now we can use, when that completion handler gets executed, we can do something in our actual function. So up here, let's call this query completion, and we'll say add query result block to our operation, and the completion is finished. So now when this comes back, we can actually do something in our code. What do we want to do when we actually get finished? So back in our view model, we set up fruits. So we want to return that final array back to the rest of our app. So we want to really call a completion from this function. So on our fetch, we're going to add a completion of type. It will be at escaping. And I will call this items, and it will be an array of, we have an array of fruit model right now, fruit model, and this will return, and this will return void. And basically when we get that final query result block, we just want to call the completion from this function, and we will pass in our returned items, which should have been filled up from this function here. So now we just pass in our returned items, and we're calling the completion to get back out of our fetch. So I also want to just point out that the fetch is the only public function we have in this section here. All these functions are private, and they're only going to be called inside our CloudKit utility. So all of this code that we wrote here, basically never going to have to rewrite because we don't have to worry about it. It's buried in our CloudKit utility, which is going to be working. So now let's call our fetch function from our app. So I'm going to come back to our app here. And we don't need an add operation in our view model. We don't need any of our query result blocks or our fetch blocks. Let's delete all of this. Let's see, our fetch items, and let's just call CloudKit utility dot fetch. We'll pass in a predicate Let's just keep the one predicate for now. Let's pass in a record type, which is just fruits. Sort descriptors, we don't need to sort by anything, so this is optional. So I'm just going to put it as nil for now, and our results limit, let's also put as nil. I don't care how many we get back, and then this will give us items. This will give us our returned items. So in here, we can just go back to the main thread, dispatch queue.main.async, and we'll call self. We should make this a weak reference. Self.fruits equals the returned items. And I'll call this returned items. We could change that later. So we don't need our operation here or any of this. Don't even need a query. Just have the predicate. All right, so when I load this view, fetch items should get called. So I'm going to, let's put our CloudKit CRUD Bootcamp onto the first screen in our app here. Let's build it to a simulator. And if we do actually fetch the items, then we know our code is working perfectly. So I'm going to open up the simulator and let's pray that we actually get some items on the screen. Bang, we got our items just like that. It looks awesome. The rock looks a little strange, but the important thing here is that we are fetching our fruits and this is looking perfect. The next thing I want to talk about though, because we still have a problem with this function, and this is where it's going to get tricky for some of you, but this fetch function is working, but right now we can only fetch an array of fruit model, and that's a problem because we can't use this to fetch any other record type in our app. So if we wanted to use this as is with a different record type, like maybe users or some maybe posts or anything else in our CloudKit database, we would have to change the type that we're getting for all of these. And that's obviously not efficient. We don't want to have to copy and paste all these functions. Obviously, we could reuse some of these that are not against it, but really what we want is this fetch function to be generic. We want to be able to fetch any type of model that's in our CloudKit database. And this is going to get tricky. I know it's going to confuse some of you, so let's take it slow. So let's jump into some of these sub-functions first, and let's see if we have, in this create operation, there is nothing in this that's referencing a fruit. So this one is good. Let's go down to this add record matched block. Add record matched block. And here we have a bunch of logic for our fruit model specifically. And it's initializing a fruit model from a CK record. So we need a way to basically initialize anything from a CK record. Whether it's a fruit model or another model, we need it to be something that we can initialize from a CK record, full stop. So what we're going to actually do is jump to where we created our fruit model, which is also in this class, I think. It's up here, fruit model. And what we're going to do is create an init inside our fruit model. So we're going to create an init. And in this init, we want to initialize a fruit model from a CK record. So we're going to pass into our init here a record of type CK record. And then we want to make a fruit model from this record. So all that code, it's this code that we already have. We're just going to copy it and paste it into our init here. And now, of course, we have this first problem is that we are going to return out of this function if we can't get a name, because we don't want to create a fruit if we can't even get a name for a fruit, because that would just be, it would look weird on our app if a fruit didn't have a name. So we're returning out of this function, and that means our initializer needs to also be failable. So there's a chance that we try to initialize it and it fails. So right now this initializer has to always succeed, but if we add a question mark in here, this actually becomes a failable initializer. So if you initialize it without it, and you go to create a fruit model, like this fruit model right here, this item will not be optional. But if you have a failable init, it basically just means it will be optional. So if we can't get the name here, we actually want to return, we have to return nil. We can't just close out of this function. We have to explicitly return nil from this failable init here. But if we can get it, we get the image here, and we can get the image URL, and then we can create the fruit model. But we actually don't need to create a new object. We need to set up the current object here. So in here, I'm going to say self.name equals name. Let's do here self.image URL equals imageasset.file URL. And we'll do self.record equals the record that we're passing in. We can get rid of this line of code. All right, so now let's use this init from our function. So coming up here, so we're just going to say let item equals, let's do a fruit model, and we can pass in a record. And now if I hold the option button and click on this item, we can see that it is optional, right? So we're going to do a guard let item equals that, else return. So same thing that we were basically doing here. And then if we can get that item, we'll call completion item. So we don't need any of this code here. And let's actually just copy that, paste it down here as well. And this is just going to be the returned record, which is slightly different. So this is already one step better. But the problem is we still have this fruit model in our code. So we want to get rid of this fruit model. We want this to be any type that can initialize from our CK record. So if you've been following this course, I want you to pause the video right now and try to think about how we could approach this step, because I've covered something kind of like this in a previous video. So I'm just going to wait a second for you guys to think about how we should approach this. It is definitely a challenge, but there is a way to do this, and I'll show you guys in a second. All right, so what we're going to do is actually create a protocol, and we're going to call it let's call it CloudKitable protocol, just for fun. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But the requirement of the protocol is that it has an available init from a CK record. So we'll pass that in here. So now when we get to this add record match block function, instead of referencing a specific fruit, we want to reference anything that conforms to CloudKitable protocol. So into this function, we are going to pass a generic type that I'll use the letter T for. And that type just needs to conform to CloudKitable protocol, just like that. All right, so this will be a generic type T. And we're getting an error here because the generic parameter T is not used in the function signature. So in order to pass in this generic type, we actually need to use that type somewhere in the function signature, which is this highlighted section here. So basically, instead of having a fruit model, we are just going to have a T, which is any type that conforms to CloudKitable protocol. And now when we create this fruit model, it's not actually going to be creating a fruit model. It's going to be creating that type. And that type needs to have this initializer. So down here, I can also create a T. And just like that, we've made our function totally generic. So now all we need is any type of model that conforms to CloudKitable protocol we can then use in this function. So coming back up here, our add record match blocks, returning an item, but of course this is still fruit model. So this fetch function we also need to make generic. So same deal, it's going to be generic T that conforms to CloudKitable protocol, and we are going to return an array of T. And this returned items will be of type T. I hope this is making sense to you. I know this is like kind of weird if you've never used these generics before, but this is basically how we write reusable, scalable code. This is if you were creating some sort of framework or library, this is how you would build out your framework using these generics and protocols like this. And then let's finally go back to our view model where we have our function. And it's not throwing in any errors right now, but if I try to run it, I believe it's going to throw an error. Yeah, here we go. So the problem with this function now is, and this is a very common error, I've run into this so many times, is that we call this static function fetch here, right? This fetch function. And we know that this fetch function takes generics. So if I call CloudKit utility.fetch, we can see that it's giving us a completion of anything that conforms to CloudKitable protocol, which is great, and that's exactly what we want. But the problem is we need to return fruits here. So we want this function to fetch us an array of type fruit. And this function, based just on this line of code that's highlighted right now, even though we're using the record type of fruits, it does not know that it actually needs to return us fruit models. So we need to give it basically some way to know specifically what type of generic type we are requesting here. We can't just request any generic type because then it could give us a different type back, right? So really what we need to do is this returned items, we need to, let's put it in parentheses, and we just need to explicitly say what type of that we want these returned items to be. And it's going to be of type, and we want to return an array of fruit model. So by adding this into the signature of the function here, it knows that it's fetching an array of fruit model. That's what that type T is going to be. And the last thing is that fruit model needs to conform to CloudKitable protocol, of course. So let's go back up to our fruit model. We already conformed to it. We just didn't actually add it here, CloudKitable protocol. That was awesome. Let's run it one more time. Let's go to the simulator, and if we are still getting our fruits, we now have a generic function to download pretty much any record type. It worked. It looks awesome. And we have this record type of fruits, but if we change this to maybe posts or whatever we wanted to download, all we need to do is change that and change out our actual type that we're getting back, and we can get pretty much we can fetch anything pretty much from our CloudKit database now using this generic, awesome utility function. I am hyped about this. I hope you guys are too. This is how you can go and start building all of your frameworks that you're using in your app. You can build out utility classes like this, or basically these are basically just like mini frameworks. One thing I do want to do though is convert this whole thing now into a future. So let's make this a private, and let's do another static func fetch, open close parentheses. This will return a future with let's do an array of fruit model for a second and possible error. Open the brackets. This will be a future. Attempt to fulfill a promise. And here we're going to call CloudKit utility.fetch. And we need to pass in our predicate, record type, all that good stuff into our fetch here. So I'm going to copy all of these parameters here. Let's paste them in here. Pass in our predicate, pass in our record type, pass in our descriptors, pass in our results limit, hit enter on the completion. We need this fruit model to actually be of type T. So let's add that generic bit of code to our fetch request here. As I explained before, we need to make these items, we need to make sure this is of type array of type T. And then in our completion here, we're just going to call the promise, and we're actually just going to call success no matter what on this one because there is no error here because we did not add any errors to this function. And we're just going to pass in our items, the items that we get back here. Going back to our code, we can now call CloudKit utility dot fetch, pass in our predicate, pass in our, let record type equals fruits. We'll pass in our record type, Sort descriptor, sort descriptions, and results limit we can keep as nil. I'm just going to delete them because we don't even need them right now. And then we can do our regular combine stuff. So let's receive on the dispatch queue.main. We don't need any options. .sync. We get this completion here, which I'm not even going to deal with. Let's just put an underscore for a second. Let's just put an underscore there for a second. You guys can deal with that on your own time. And then we have received value, and this will be returned items in. Let's make this a weak self. In here, we're going to set self.fruits equal to returned items. Let's go up the top here. Let's import combine. Let's create our var cancellables. Set it equal to a set of any cancelable. And this will be our, let's store this in cancellables. And again, we could have just used these escape enclosures. We don't need to convert these to combine and use these future publishers, but I just like to get it good practice in because in most of the apps I create these days, we are using combine. Let's run this. Let's run this quickly. Let's open this up, and it's still working. So we're now using combine to actually fetch from our generic fetch function, which is pretty mind-blowing, honestly. This is like some really advanced code. If you guys are following along and you're understanding this, you are like well on your way to becoming an expert developer, because this is basically how you start writing those really advanced frameworks. When you guys are using third-party frameworks, when you're importing your CocoaPods, this is the type of code that's in those CocoaPods. It's things like this that are generic enough that you can use in pretty much any project and access some sort of underlying framework like we're accessing CloudKit here. And I hope you guys are still following along. This is getting to be a very long video, but definitely the most important in the series. I think it's going to be the hardest video I've ever made. Which is exciting and scary at the same time because I'm worried that it might be too hard for some people. Let me know in the comments below if this is too challenging. Maybe I need to go back to some easier stuff for a few videos after this playlist. But this is the end of the advanced learning playlist, right? So if you got this far, you're advanced. Welcome to the advanced club. If this is not challenging, then you're just an expert already. Because this stuff should be challenging to write. It's hard for me to write the first time. I've already written all of this in a practice version before writing this, but the first time I had to write all this, it was a challenge for me. So I don't want you guys to go think I'm just like going at this right now. Like I have this all pre-recorded because I don't want to spend so much time with errors. But this is hard code for anyone to write. But it's really important that you guys understand exactly what it's doing and how we got to this point. Let's get into the end of this video now. Let's do the add item function, which is essentially going to be the opposite of our fetch item function. So I'm going to come down here. Let's create a static func. Let's call it add, and I'm going to open close parentheses, open the brackets. I don't want to get confused with this one, but this one is a private function, so we're never going to actually be able to call this from our view model. This one will be public, so this will be the only actual add function we get from our view model. First thing we're going to do is pretty much the opposite again of what we just did. So coming back up to our fruit model, right now we have an init where we have a CK record here. But what if we want to create a fruit model not from a CK record, but from that new name that we're typing into our app here? So for that, we actually are going to need another init. Let's also make this one fallible, and let's pass in a name of type string, and we'll open the brackets. So if we get the name, obviously we can set up the name. So self.name equals name. And then let's actually also pass in an optional image URL. So I'll pass that in here. So do self.image URL equals image URL. And then we need to set up a CK record. So in here we can say let record equals CK record. open the parentheses, and we can pass in and we're going to pass in a record type. We don't have a record ID because it's not coming from the database. It's just a record type here, which will be our fruits. And now we can't just set self.record equal to record, because this record right now, it's just a blank record. It doesn't actually have the name in it. It doesn't actually have the image URL. Like here we are setting up this fruit model, but that's not actually the record. The record here, right, this is just a blank record. So really what we want to do is call record, and we'll pass in name, and we'll set it equal to the name that we passed in this function. And then we want to add the image. So remember, the image needs to be a CK asset, right? So looking down at our code, we had that CK asset. Where'd it go? We created it from the file URL after we after we saved it. So let's do that same thing. I'm going to copy those lines of code and just put them up here. So we'll say, so we basically want to do this only if we actually have an image URL. So we'll say if let URL equals image URL. Let's cut this, paste it in here. So we get the name added to the record. We get the image added to the record. And then I think this will work, but really what we want to do is not add our names in here directly, but we want to actually just create this record. And then after we have this record all set up, we actually want to initialize based on this record. This way all of our fruits are kind of streamlined. They're set up the exact same way. So from in this init, I'm going to actually call this init, because now that we have our CK record, we can call this one. So I'm going to call self.init, and we're going to pass in our new record. And I know it is just like Inception because we're doing an init inside an init, crazy stuff, but now we can create basically a fruit model that has a CK record from a name and an image URL. So I'm going to come down here, add item. The first thing, we don't need this new fruit here. Let's pretend like we still have the image and the data, and we write it to the URL. And then in here, we're going to say let new fruit equals fruit model, open the parentheses, and then we have the name and URL. So I'll pass in the name, and I'll pass in the URL. And then we can delete this asset stuff here because that's being done in our init already. And now we can get this new fruit, and we want to save it. So firstly, let's get this save function into our CloudKit utility. We'll do a static func save. And we're going to save a record of type CK record, open the brackets. I'm going to copy this code and paste it into our CloudKit utility. Let's check this out quickly. CK container, the default, save the record. That's perfect. We don't need weak self here. Returned record, returned error. We don't need our prints. We don't need our dispatch queue. We don't even need to call fetch again from here. So let's just delete all this. We just want to know if there's an error, and if there's an error, let's call our completion. So let's add a completion of type at escaping, and this will be a result. Back to our results, the Boolean for success and a possible error. Let's return void, and in here we're going to say if let error equals returned error. So if there is an error, let's call completion, and we'll pass in the error. Else, if there's no error, we'll call completion dot success, and that will be true. This will actually be failure, and we'll pass in the error. All right, we got our save function going here, and we actually want to call it from our add function. So we're going to call here save to CloudKit. This will be save, and we need to pass in a record, and then we get a completion back. So this completion we want to send all the way back to our view model. So when we call this add function, it should also have this completion. So I'm going to copy this, paste it in here. And because this completion is the same as this completion, we can just pass our completion in like that, nice and sexy. And then we have the only problem we have now is that this add function needs a CK record. So I could say record of type CK record. And we could pass that in here. And that would be fine. So I could come in here and we can call CloudKit utility dot save. We can, this new fruit is actually optional. So because of our failable init, so we should say guard let new fruit equals this, else return. And we can then access the record inside that new fruit. So we could say new fruit dot record, and then we get our completion back, and this will be our result, which I'm just going to leave blank for a second. So this is one step closer to what we want, but the problem is we still are trying to get this record in our code here, and we still have to create this fruit model in our code. So to make this a little bit more convenient for us, what we're going to pass into this add function is not a CK record, but any model that has a record inside it. So part of our CloudKitable protocol will be having a constant called record. And we're going to have to make it a variable, and we're going to have to make it get only. And now when we go to make this add function, we're actually going to pass in anything that's type T that conforms to CloudKitable protocol. And we're going to pass in T as the item. And then in here, we're going to say get record. And the record will say let record equals item dot record. Because any item, as long as it's T, it needs to have that record. So we pass that in here. So we didn't really need to do that. We could have just kept it as is with our new fruit, but I like it a little bit better just to make sure everything is conforming to our CloudKitable protocol. So now back in our code, when we call this CloudKit utility, we can call .add, and we can pass in our new fruit directly. We don't have to worry about getting the record from it. And then we have our result as well. So in here, I'm just going to do what we did before, the little dispatch queue.main async after. Let's do now plus 2 seconds. And then we'll just call, what is it? Self.fetch. Just for a second, let's see if it works. So let's build this to the simulator quick. And if I add a new item, let's press add, and then 2 seconds later, hopefully it comes back. And I think it worked. I think my UI just didn't update because this is a very poorly written UI. But if I reload the app, I think my new item is going to be there. New item. So yeah, it did add, it did save. We just didn't update the UI back correctly. A good method a good method for this, because the CloudKit takes a second to actually add, is maybe if the result is successful, instead of refetching items, we should probably just like append this fruit model to our fruits array manually, and then we don't have to worry about refetching. I think that would be a better solution. So you would switch on the result, and then if the result was successful, just append to that array and all will be good. I'm not going to run through that because this video is so long. I'm also not going to make this add function a future publisher. We could, but it's going to get tricky doing that with our do statement here. In a bigger app, you would probably want to move some of this code as well into some sort of image manager, and this whole thing would kind of start going into different sections of your code. But I think this was a good function to write. Let's wrap up. We have 2 more functions on this view model to do. We don't need this save item anymore because we add that to our CloudKit utility. So we have add, we have fetch, we have update. Let's update an item now. So let's come in here. This is decent code, but what we should really do even better than this is do our update inside our model itself. So I'm going to go back up to our model here and create a little func. Let's call it update. Let's give it a new name of type string. And we want this function to return us a new fruit model. So these are structs. So because we're changing the values, we actually need to create a totally new fruit model, except this new fruit model is going to have a new name and we want to use the current image URL. Now we're going to get a problem here because when we call this right here, this is actually this initializer, and this initializer is going to create a brand new CK record. So the CK record we would get in this fruit model is going to be then different from the CK record that's already in our current existing fruit model. So really what we want to do in here is, what we're doing in this code already is basically take our current record, which will come from the record that's inside our current fruit. So we'll just set it as record. We're going to give it a new name. So we'll pass in our new name. And then let's initialize a new fruit model from this record that we already have. So this way when we create this record, and we need to return here, but this way when we are initializing this fruit model from a record, we're using the record ID that's already in our record. We're not creating a brand new record. And this needs to be optional because this is an optional init here. And let's come down to our code, and basically what we're going to do in here is we'll call fruit.update, and we'll pass in a new name, and then we'll call CloudKit utility.save, and we'll pass in, and it's looking for CK record. So coming back to our CloudKit utility here, this is fine, honestly. This is fine, honestly. We could do that. I like using this CloudKitable protocol though. So, and I'm looking back at our code here, and we actually are doing the same thing already in our add function. We're just getting the record from inside our item, our CloudKitable protocol, and then we're saving it back down. So this static func add, we could actually reuse this function. So some people might do add or update, and then they'll just use the same function twice. What I'm gonna actually do is copy this and just make another function called update. And in my update function, I'm just going to call add, and I'll pass in the item and the completion just like that. Just to have two separate functions, but we know because this is just calling this function, they're doing the exact same thing. So in our code here, we can just call CloudKit utility.update. We'll pass in our fruit. And this actually this returns us a fruit. So we'll say let new fruit equals fruit.update, right? Because this is returning us a optional fruit model. So we'll do a little guard, let that equals that, else return. Pass in our new fruit. We get our completion here. And this will be our result, which I'm not going to worry about for right now. Let's delete all of this. So now we don't call save or anything, we just call update, and when it's done, we're going to get that result back. So here I'm just going to print update completed. Let's run our app one more time. And I think, when do we call update item? When we tap on an item. So if I click on one, coconut, update completed, and we did not refetch, so we should actually just, after we get the update completed, let's call fetch items again, just for now. I'll have to do self.fetch items. This should be weak self. Oh, so much code in this video. This is crazy, guys. Orange and new name. Update is working perfectly. Our very last one is going to be the delete, which is a nice and easy function here. Let's come down here. Let's do a static private func delete. I'm going to copy this code here. So let's make this first function the same as like this save function. So we'll do so we'll pass in a record, and we'll pass in a completion for success as well. Just do that. And this is all right. We don't need our weak self here. We don't need our dispatch queue or this. So we're just going to say if let error equals error or returned error. If we get an error, we'll call completion dot failure. We'll pass in our error. Else, we'll call completion dot success, and we'll pass in true. And now I'm making this a private delete because we're going to make one more static func delete. And this one is going to be accessible from our view model. And we're going to make this with our CloudKitable protocol as well. So I will pass that in here. And we're going to pass in an item and the same completion. So I'll just copy it, paste it here. All right, and then in here from this function, we're going to call CloudKit utility dot delete. I'm going to look for the one with the record. And from here, we're going to pass in our item dot record because anything that conforms to CloudKitable protocol has to have that record. And then we'll just pass in our completion because it's the exact same. And even this function, we're going to go one step further. So we'll make this private and we'll wrap this in a future. So we'll say static func delete again. This time we will return a future with a bool and an error. Let's pass in our generic here and our item. And in here, we're going to call future, go into the future, attempt to fulfill a promise. And that promise, of course, is going to be CloudKit utility.delete. Looking for the one with a CloudKitable protocol. Pass in our item. And our completion here, we will just call promise. I think we could have just done this completion promise in some of the earlier futures as well, although I'm not going to go back and check right now. So now in our delete item, we could very simply do something like CloudKit utility.delete, and we got to pass in something that conforms to CloudKitable protocol, which of course will just be our fruit. We don't even need to access the record directly, and then we can call, let's receive on the main queue, dispatch queue.main, don't need no options, and let's sync it, of course. The completion, I'll do an underscore. I'm not going to deal with it. The receive value will be success. And here I'll just print out delete is, and let's just print out the success. And finally, let's store this in our cancelables. And if we get a success, we want to remove it from the index here. So we'll do remove at the index, and we should make this weak self, and then we can get rid of this code here. All right, let's run this one final time. And hopefully we did everything correctly. And I'm going to take let's do the apple. Just because it stands out, let's delete it. And delete is true. And we now deleted. So we converted our delete to a publisher as well. So a couple things I want to go over quickly. We didn't have to make these delete functions conform to this CloudKitable protocol. We could access this one directly. This is kind of how you want to set up your code. If you want direct access to that CK record, so if you want to just access it and send that directly into a function, that's easier. You could do that from your view model. There's no problem with that. I'm doing a CloudKitable protocol just so that, like for my project, I would know anything that's going to be in CloudKit, let's conform to CloudKitable protocol. And as long as it conforms to CloudKitable protocol, we know we'll be able to use it throughout our CloudKit functions, which is pretty cool. One really cool thing with this when we use protocols like this is that we are simply initializing, where is it? We are very simply initializing those CloudKitable protocols from a record. You notice how there's nothing in this function that's related to having a name or having an image URL in that model. So we could do something like this, where we go to our fruit model, and let's say maybe someone comes back and one day says, hey, we're going to make an update to our app. We want our fruits to now have a count. Maybe it's a shopping app and people have 5 apples, 4 oranges in the shopping cart. Well, all the stuff for updating and creating fruits, all that code is right here in our model. So I can just very simply do something like this. Let maybe count of type int. When I initialize from a CK record, we'll do, we'll say let count equals the record, and we'll access the count field, and we'll try to cast it as an integer. And then we'll say self.count equals count, which will be optional because some of them obviously aren't going to have a count. So we'll do otherwise 0. We can always start with our default 0. Coming down to this init, we could also pass in like a count here, type int. Let's say here if let count equals count. We'll put in the record count equals count. And down here, we could keep our update the same. Maybe we're not updating the count. One thing I also want to point out while we're here is these are strings, and I'm hard coding them in this tutorial. So you really should have these referenced somewhere in your code. Like you have some sort of other, maybe it's a struct called CloudKit fruit model names. And in here you have like a static let name, and we'll set it equal to name, something like that. And then you could do something like CloudKit fruit model names dot name instead of actually putting in the hard-coded strings. That's just a much better approach. I'm not going to go through all that, just throwing it out there. Let's see here. We added our count. We don't need our update. And when we initialize, we're going to get an error then. So here, I'm going to just fix it. Let's give a count of 5 when we add a new one. So let's run our app. I'm going to add another item. So let's call this one, what don't we have here? Well, we have like no fruits in our fruit list anymore. Let's go with another coconut. I'm going to add it. Nothing printed out. I don't know if we got rid of our print statements here. We also forgot to blank out the text field after we add something, but let's check our CloudKit container quickly. I'm going to requery the records, and we have our coconut here. If I click on it and look inside, I can see this brand new field with a count of 5. So it was that easy to add a new field to my data model. I really want to stress how awesome that is, because all we did was update literally I don't know, 4 or 5 lines of code inside our fruit model here. We added a count, we added it into our init here and our init here, and that's it. We didn't have to change any of these CloudKit functions for downloading, for updating. Everything is nice and organized. This is the only place where we have to deal and manage with the fruit models inside the fruit model. This is a really, really scalable architecture. If you want to challenge yourself, the last video we did on CloudKit was for push notifications, and we did not convert these into our CloudKit utilities. So if you want to challenge yourself, go take these functions, this request, this subscribe, this unsubscribe. They're pretty simple functions, and try to add them to your CloudKit and then reference those instead of calling CK container in here. So when you do that, you should be able to remove CloudKit from this file completely and only access CloudKit inside your CloudKit utility. All right, guys, so much code in this video, such a long video, way longer than I expected, but this was some really good code. I hope you guys stuck with me. We basically created a mini framework in our app. This CloudKit utility class can now be used in any app that we have, as long as we have this CloudKittable protocol. So we should actually probably put the CloudKittable protocol in this file as well. Let's actually do that quickly. Just gonna cut my CloudKittable protocol, and let's just put it up here. So this way I can just literally cut this entire file, paste it into any Xcode project, and I can immediately start using all my CloudKit functions, which is so awesome, so fun. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. We use generics to make our functions work with pretty much like any kind of data type as long as they conform to the protocol. We obviously then also use protocols, and we did some fancy stuff with futures to convert our escape enclosures into publishers that we could then use with Combine. So much going on in this video. I know it was hard. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Leave a like, leave a comment on this video. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Was this too hard? Was this too challenging? Or is this the kind of stuff you guys want to see? Because this is definitely professional level code here. If you're understanding this, you are well beyond a beginner developer. I can say that with confidence. Thank you guys for watching, and if you felt like this video was worth a coffee, I will leave a link below if you want to buy me a coffee. Thank you guys for all the support. As always, I am Nick, this is Swiftful Thinking, and you're now an advanced developer.